So we're here with Julia Dehm, who is a lecturer at Truro University Law School in Melbourne, who, as you know, is one of the co-editors of the special issue on human rights and economic inequality that was assigned for this session. So thanks a lot, Julia, for being with us and for dedicating some of your time to the students of global justice at the University of Antwerp. So Julia.
No worries.
Julia, one of the things that we were discussing is the importance and the opportunities behind the notion of human rights and the tools of human rights. And you have a lot of experience both as an academic, as a legal activist. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you see human rights and the possibilities behind human rights?
Sure. So I think one of the really powerful things about human rights is that they have become a really powerful discourse of justice and a very strong moral discourse too, that people use in different ways to, claim these rights. And I think for activists in particular, framing an injustice as a human rights violation gives you access to a whole range of different institutional architectures, whether that is constitutional rights in some countries, whether that's international treaties, international treaty bodies, international courts in some regional systems, that you can then use as a forum for making those claims. So there's a lot of strategic reasons why people would want to frame, why activists or people who've been suffering an injustice would want to frame a particular harm as a human rights violation. I think particularly because of all these mechanisms that have been established that can help you get some sort of redress through these sort of processes then as well.
Thanks, Julia. So we are looking at these infrastructures, and we're looking also at the difficulty that some people have in accessing this structure, and some of the problems with mobilizing these structures. But one of the issues that you point out in your work and in the special issue is that even if we frame justice in human rights, there is something that we may be missing about inequality and building an equal society. So can you tell us more about the disconnection between human rights and inequality, and how can we address that gap that you are identifying in the discourse?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's precisely one of the concerns that we have, that even though you can frame things as human rights harm, that necessarily doesn't relate to questions of justice. There's a gap between rights and justice, and particularly in terms of distributive justice. And so there's been a really active debate, particularly in the last couple of years. Philip Alston, in his role as Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, put out a report in 2015 in which he was saying that this global inequality that's been documented by Piketty, that the Occupy movement sort of rose up against, that this is one of the largest human rights issues, and that the human rights movement needs to engage much more with these questions of economic inequality. And he was quite optimistic that human rights have got the tools to do this. And that sort of sparked a whole debate. And in response, other scholars were much more sceptical about whether human rights were an appropriate tool or idiom for making these sort of claims, particularly for more redistributive mechanisms. So Samuel Moyen, famously, both in a journal article, Powerless Companion, sort of talked about how human rights has been, risen alongside neoliberalism and hasn't really prevented the worst excesses of neoliberalism in any way, that it's been powerless in relation to that. And has said too that in relation to inequality, the problem really has been that human rights has had nothing to say about it. That human rights, even economic and social rights, that have been much more focused on sort of material well-being as opposed to civil and political rights, has predominantly focused on providing a floor of sufficiency. And they haven't focused on addressing or rising, the loss of any sort of ceiling or cap on how much wealth people can accumulate in our system of neoliberal capitalism. And then, Moyen's taken a particular position there, sort of saying that human rights have just been incapable of addressing these sort of harms, whereas other scholars, writing much more sort of from a Marxist or a critical vein, have sort of said, look, human rights have actually potentially been more complicit in the rise of neoliberalism, that this sort of quite individual framework of individual rights, again, doesn't help us articulate demands for social justice. So Susan Marks has made these sort of arguments saying there's much greater complicity between the rise of neoliberalism and human rights. More recently, Jessica White, in her fabulous book, Morals of the Market, has sort of talked about how human rights have not been powerless companions against the rise of neoliberalism, but in some ways have been active, enthusiastic, and influential fellow travellers, that we've seen sort of rights of corporations being articulated in the framework of human rights. And that is to see echoes of arguments from third world scholars such as Aprenda Bakshi, who over a decade ago already diagnosed the rise of what he called trade-related market-friendly human rights. So there have been all these critiques about whether human rights is complicit even in the rise of inequality and whether it's capable of doing something about it. In my own scholarship, I was sort of concerned about that when we were talking about human rights, we're sort of taking human rights as a very fixed thing and object. And I felt that it'd be important to look at this more historically about how human rights has at different moments in time engaged with the problem of inequality. And by doing that, I was able to look at how human rights discourses and practices have actually changed over time due to precisely contestation and particularly advocacy of, practitioners and scholars from the global south. So in that sort of traced how particularly, in the 1950s, you have a lot of sort of rights language is more about national rights, self-determination, these sort of collective rights. In the 1970s, you see a whole discourse where a lot of the third world sort of movement was linking the human rights agenda to a broader agenda for a new international economic order. So, which was calling for a structural reorganization of the global economy. And then they were saying, we cannot have the realization of economic and social rights unless we have a new international economic order, unless we rearrange global economic relations. And so then it was a much broader discourse there about what were the structural conditions that make the realization of these rights possible. And then that, I think, opened up to a much broader critique. You also had, again, the third world pushing the idea of right to development, which was, again, had some sort of elements of a slightly more redistributive claim in there, even though when it was passed in 1986, it was a very minimal sort of thing that had no actual concrete redistributive obligations. But then I sort of also traced, however, the 1980s, we see as part of sort of trying to make economic and social rights real and judiciable and sort of more concrete. I think a lot of human rights scholars and practitioners sort of also narrowed the scope of how these rights are conceptualized. So rather than thinking, what are the structural conditions that we need to have to make the realization of these rights possible, we start having a conception that focuses much more on how do we have some obligations of conduct rather than results to protect a minimum core of rights. So a much more narrow focus on sufficiency, basic rights and stuff emerging in that discourse. And in the work of some practitioners and scholars and advocates, a quite explicit move away from norms of distributive justice with this idea of, no, we need to be pragmatic and call for what we think might be viable instead, which is a much more minimal demand of sufficiency. And then over the 1990s, I've also traced how you have the take-up of debates about income inequality and human rights and the relationship between them in UN treaty bodies and some sort of mandate holders sort of taking up these specific questions. But in that, they kept saying, okay, we need to focus not so much on inequality of outcomes, but inequality of opportunity. And again, during this period when we have a rise of neoliberal globalization, that we again, human rights discourse has been reluctant sort of to critique these structural conditions that are giving rise to this and the rise of inequality. So you have sort of a much more narrow focus. And so now again, too, in a lot of the human rights debates around inequality, the focus is on extreme inequality rather than inequality per se, or inequality of opportunity rather than inequality of outcomes. And so what I found helpful in going back to history is going, look, there are also other ways in which we can think about this relationship, and there might be more radical ways. And so potentially by looking at that, it can give us inspiration and tools for thinking about the ways in which we might want to extend our understandings of human rights, stretch them and push them in particular ways. And as well as turning to history, again, I think it's really important to turn to social movements and have a look at what people are really doing, sort of claim making that is happening, that is trying to push these institutional frameworks that can be quite narrow in some ways, to expand them and look at them in more different ways. But that said too, I think at the same time, even though I think there's a lot that we can do to make the human rights frameworks more open, more responsive, more able to think about these broader questions of distribution, I wouldn't want human rights to be the only vocabulary in which we articulate claims of global justice. I think it's really important to keep alive other ways of naming these injustices, and naming the structural conditions that give rise to them, and critiquing these relations of capital, of neoliberalism, of domination of various sorts, and to find broader ways of mobilizing against them, as well as, within but also outside of human rights systems. So hopefully that's sort of given you a interesting overview of some of my thinking on these questions.
Extremely useful, extremely clear, extremely detailed, despite the limited amount of time that we had. And also a little bit of final optimism and a little bit of invitation to do more and to find the cracks that exist in the system, rather than rejecting everything or just buying it blindly and thinking that all the solutions are already there. Julia, it was fantastic, and I myself learned a lot from listening to you, and I'm sure that my students would really appreciate your intervention. I hope there will be in the future the possibility of having you physically in Antwerp to share more of your thoughts and more of your scholarship and more of your very interesting and energetic ideas with all of us here in Antwerp. Stay safe, and definitely thanks a lot. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of interesting conversation and a lot of thoughts that will be sparkled by your intervention in the lecture. Thanks a lot, Julia.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.